The air along the Savannah River carried a stillness that summer, a kind of breathless waiting that seemed to hang between the trees. Spanish moss swayed like old ghosts above the dirt road that led to Riverwood Plantation, a sprawling estate whose white columns gleamed against the dusk. Travelers often said it looked serene from a distance, perfect, prosperous, timeless. But those who worked its fields, those who lived beneath its rules, knew that beauty often wore a mask. Riverwood belonged to the Hargrove family, among the wealthiest in Chatham County. Thomas Hargrove was known for his stern precision, a man who measured everything in profit and punishment. His wife, Eleanor, maintained the house with quiet grace and unyielding order. To outsiders, their home was a symbol of Southern gentility. But beneath the magnolia trees, where the shadows stretched long, there were whispers that something inside that house had begun to change. In July of 1852, the plantation's rhythm faltered. The bells stopped ringing. No wagons came from the harbor. No voices rose from the veranda. The Hargroves were simply gone. At first, neighboring planters assumed illness. Fevers swept through the low country every summer, and isolation was common. But days turned into weeks, and still no word came from Riverwood. The cotton fields remained tended, the smokehouse active, the horses groomed. Yet, those who passed along the road spoke of an unnatural quiet, the kind of silence that makes the skin crawl before the mind even knows why. When William Parker, overseer of a nearby plantation, rode over to investigate, he found the workers at Riverwood carrying out their duties as if nothing were wrong. The house looked untouched, dinner plates still laid on the long mahogany table, candles burned halfway down. No sign of struggle, no sign of life. And at the center of it all stood Solomon, the plantation's blacksmith, a man of uncommon calm and unsettling composure. He greeted Parker with perfect courtesy, explaining that Master Hargrove had departed on business, leaving him in charge. It was absurd, unthinkable, an enslaved man claiming authority over an estate. Yet, Solomon's tone left no space for argument. His eyes, Parker would later say, held the weight of someone who already knew how the story would end. What Parker didn't know, what no one yet realized, was that Riverwood's silence was not born of absence, but of confinement. That beneath the grand house, behind freshly laid brick, a secret was waiting. Iron, darkness, and breath. And as the evening light faded across the marshes, the crickets began their song again, the first sound after weeks of silence. But even they seemed cautious, as if aware that something beneath their feet was listening. Before the name Solomon was whispered in fear across Savannah, it was written in ink, in the property ledgers of Charleston, 1848. Male, aged approximately 30. Literate, skilled in carpentry and metalwork. A short description, cold and transactional, for a man whose mind burned with quiet, calculated thought. He had been sold away from his wife and 2 small children, their faces fading behind him as the ship left the dock. Those who saw him arrive at Riverwood said he carried himself differently from the others, not with defiance, but with an unsettling steadiness. He spoke little. He listened. And when he looked at something, a tool, a lock, a chain, it was as if he were already imagining how it could be remade. Thomas Hargrove valued skill more than personality. He assigned Solomon to the blacksmith shop, repairing hinges, gates, wagon wheels. Over time, Solomon became indispensable. His craft was flawless, his silence even more so. He learned the routines, the weaknesses of the estate, the cracks in both metal and men. Yet what he endured was unspeakable. Punishments for imagined insolence. Whippings for pausing in thought. Weeks spent in isolation for contemplation unbecoming. Each lash was meant to erase his will, and instead, it engraved something else: patience, calculation, a blueprint. There are scattered testimonies from other enslaved workers, fragments that survived through letters and oral stories. They describe Solomon as a man with eyes like fire under ice, a craftsman whose hands could create beauty and destruction with equal precision. One account tells of how he once repaired the master's hunting rifle so flawlessly that Thomas Hargrove joked, "If you ever turn this on me, Solomon, I'll have only myself to blame." Solomon had smiled then, a faint, almost imperceptible curve of the mouth. "Then I reckon you'd be right, sir." No one remembered laughing after that. Some say the plan began when he overheard Hargrove boast about selling another family apart, a child, no older than Solomon's own had been. Others believe it began long before, perhaps on the deck of the ship that brought him south, when he realized that men who saw themselves as masters could be broken not by death, but by reflection. And so he began to forge, quietly, methodically. Night after night, under the hum of cicadas and the dull glow of the forge, he shaped not tools, but symbols. Bars, locks, hinges, pieces that fit together too perfectly to be coincidence. To anyone passing by, it was just maintenance. To Solomon, it was architecture. He wasn't building rebellion. He was building a mirror, one that would force his oppressors to see themselves as he had always seen them, caged. By the summer of 1852, the forge was complete, and so was Solomon's design. For the first few days after the Hargrove family vanished, the plantation ran with eerie precision. The bells rang at dawn. The cotton was picked, bundled, weighed. Meals were prepared. The house was swept. To anyone riding past, Riverwood appeared perfectly alive. But it wasn't. It was performing life. William Parker, the overseer from the neighboring estate, would later recall that the silence hung thicker than the heat. No laughter from the quarters. No hymns drifting through the fields. Even the animals moved with a strange obedience, as though they too understood that something sacred or unspeakable had happened. When Parker asked where the family had gone, the field hands would lower their eyes. Some murmured, "Master's away." Others simply shook their heads. All directed him to Solomon. And Solomon, ever composed, told him calmly that Mr. Hargrove had left him in charge, a statement so absurd that Parker nearly laughed. But the steadiness in Solomon's voice made laughter impossible. Inside the main house, everything was immaculate. Dishes untouched. Beds made. A faint smell of candle wax lingering in the air. It was as though the family had risen one night and dissolved into the shadows. Yet beneath the house, below those polished floors, a different truth lay breathing in the dark. No one could hear the cries. The cellar had been rebuilt, the entrance sealed behind a false wall of brick that only Solomon knew how to open. And below, in iron cages crafted with surgical precision, the Hargrove family lived their final days, not as masters, but as captives. The other enslaved workers knew. Not all, but enough. Some helped him carry supplies. Some watched in horror, paralyzed by fear or by something harder to name, understanding. For generations, they had been forced to obey, to bow, to break. Now, for the first time, the order of things had shifted. The ones who gave commands were the ones who wept in the dark. Yet the silence was not celebration. It was survival. Every whisper, every glance could mean death. So they kept working, singing no songs, looking no one in the eye, pretending the world was still the same. 3 weeks passed before anyone outside Riverwood dared to question the disappearance. When Colonel James Hargrove, Thomas's brother, arrived from Charleston, the illusion began to crack. He brought with him the kind of authority Solomon could not politely dismiss. Within days, his men began to search the barns, the quarters, the well. Finally, one of them noticed fresh mortar beneath the main house. When the brick wall broke open, the stench of death rushed out like a secret too long contained. Lanterns flickered, and there, within cages of iron, lay the family who once ruled Riverwood. The horror was not in the sight alone, but in the craftsmanship. Every hinge, every lock spoke of intention. Someone had planned this. Patiently. Precisely. And the silence of Riverwood finally broke into screams. When the search party pried open the narrow passage behind the false brick wall, the air that poured out was thick and old, a scent of iron, rot, and something far more haunting, fear that had once been alive. Lanterns shook in the trembling hands of the men as they crawled into the hollow space. What they found beneath Riverwood Plantation would never appear in the official papers as anything more than improvised detention structures. But the truth was much worse. Behind the bricks lay a row of iron cages, crude yet skillfully crafted, the kind only a blacksmith could forge. Inside them were the remains of Thomas Hargrove, his wife Eleanor, and their 3 children. They had not been murdered in haste. Every sign spoke of deliberate design. The cages were measured so precisely that the prisoners could neither stand fully upright nor lie flat. Every breath, every movement had been an act of discomfort, a mirror of the ships that had once carried men like Solomon across the Atlantic. Sheriff Thomas Blackwood, who led the investigation, wrote only a few lines in his journal that night. "This is not murder. This is message." The discovery left even hardened men pale. Colonel Hargrove fell to his knees, screaming his brother's name until his voice broke. But the others, the workers who had been forced to accompany the search, said nothing. Some turned away. Some wept quietly. An older woman, whispered, "Now they know." Every part of that underground chamber bore Solomon's hand. The welds were clean, the locks seamless, the hinges noiseless. He had worked for months in plain sight, under the pretense of repairing farm tools. The forge had been his confessional, each spark from his hammer another word in a language no one around him had yet learned to read. According to letters later found in the Savannah archives, evidence suggested the family lived in those cages for nearly 2 weeks before dying of dehydration. Food and water had been given sparingly, just enough to prolong awareness. That detail alone chilled the investigators more than the bodies. It meant Solomon had wanted them awake long enough to feel what it was to be owned, to wait on mercy that never came. There was no spectacle of violence here. No fire, no rebellion. Just the quiet horror of precision, a craftsman turning his trade into philosophy. The discovery spread in whispers through Georgia's plantations like a fever. Men who once prided themselves on control now slept with pistols by their beds. Others filled in the spaces beneath their homes with stone and soil, as if afraid the earth itself might rise to remember. And Solomon, the man at the center of it all, was nowhere to be found. Not yet. The cages remained, silent and gleaming in the torchlight, testimony to a terrible symmetry. The enslaved had become the architect, the master the captive. It was vengeance not shouted, but engineered. To most who heard of the Riverwood tragedy, Solomon was a monster, a name spoken only in whispers, followed by prayers. But to those who looked closer, there was something more haunting than cruelty in his actions: intent. Every detail of his plan reflected not chaos, but control. He hadn't simply reversed roles, he had built a mirror. Think of it: the cage's dimensions, the starvation timed to the hour, the way the Hargroves could hear the sounds of the plantation running above them, footsteps, laughter, work songs. It wasn't just punishment. It was a demonstration, a living tableau of power inverted. In Solomon's own writings, fragments found decades later, scrawled in coded symbols, scholars discovered one chilling line. To understand justice, one must feel the shape of chains. He wasn't seeking freedom. He was seeking understanding, a cruel, philosophical symmetry where those who dehumanized others were forced to experience the precise geometry of that dehumanization. Dr. Margaret Carver, who studied the Riverwood Papers before her research mysteriously vanished in 1969, described Solomon's design as a psychological mirror, a reflection of slavery turned inward. The cages, she wrote, were not built for death, but for comprehension. That, perhaps, is what terrified people most. This wasn't a frenzied act of rebellion. It was education, methodical, surgical, moral. And nothing is more terrifying than the idea that vengeance can be intellectual. When the Hargrove family realized their fate, they would have heard the daily life of the enslaved echoing above them, the scrape of boots, the ring of hammers, the soft murmur of prayer. For the first time, they became the unheard, voices crying into a silence they once enforced. Witnesses later claimed Solomon continued visiting the hidden cellar in those weeks, bringing ledgers and tools, asking Thomas Hargrove for instructions, mocking him through routine. "Master," he would reportedly say, "shall I record today's yield?" The man in the cage could only weep. Was it cruelty? Undeniably. But beneath that cruelty lay something cold and deliberate, a message to every plantation owner who believed control was divine order. Solomon was saying, if power can be built, it can be reversed. If one man can be owned, another can unmake the illusion. And that message spread faster than any rumor. Across the Low Country, plantation owners began locking their workshops, restricting skilled labor, and teaching their children to sleep lightly. Fear became the new overseer. The horror of Riverwood was never just the death of one family. It was the revelation that mastery itself was fragile. That beneath every whip and ledger lay a tremor, the possibility that one day, those who were silent might choose to speak in iron. Solomon didn't just kill his oppressors. He rewrote the language of terror. And history, unprepared to read it, buried the book. In the weeks after the discovery at Riverwood, fear seeped through Georgia's plantations like rising water through cracked earth. It was invisible at first, an unspoken tension at supper tables, a flicker of unease in the eyes of men who once thought themselves untouchable. The newspapers said nothing. The county court sealed the files under the phrase, administrative irregularities. But word, as it always does, found its way through the backroads and kitchens, through hushed conversations and trembling hands. Every whispered retelling twisted the details further. Some said the Hargroves had been devoured by their own slaves, others that Solomon's spirit still roamed the fields. Yet beneath the myth ran a truth everyone could feel. Something sacred to the Southern order had been shattered. By autumn, merchants in Savannah were selling new locks and iron grates for household security. Planters started filling the crawl spaces beneath their mansions with stone. Overseers doubled their patrols, suspicion replacing civility. And the enslaved? They said little, but their silence now held power. Every quiet glance, every pause in the fields carried the ghost of Riverwood. A master's command that once went unquestioned now hung in the air just a moment too long before obedience followed. That hesitation was small, but it was everything. One letter from a plantation owner named William Crawford captures the unease perfectly. The Riverwood affair has cast a shadow over us all. Even as I dine, I feel watched by the very people who serve the food. There is something different in their stillness. A thought behind their eyes I dare not name. In a society built entirely on control, even the suspicion of thought was enough to inspire terror. Churches filled with panicked sermons about divine order, about the dangers of educating the Negro mind. Politicians met behind closed doors to discuss new restrictions, laws that would later ban enslaved people from learning certain trades, particularly metalwork. Solomon's Forge had become a symbol of something far more dangerous than rebellion. It was intellect in motion. But among the enslaved communities, Riverwood became something else entirely, a ghost story, a parable whispered over dying embers. Some saw Solomon as cursed, others as avenger. Yet all agreed on one thing: he had made them seen. Even if through horror, even if through blood, he had turned their invisible suffering into a story no master could fully bury. Meanwhile, Colonel James Hargrove, the dead man's brother, ordered the immediate sale of every enslaved worker from Riverwood. He scattered them across the South, hoping to erase the memory by dissolving the witnesses. But memories don't vanish with distance. They migrate. And so the tale of Solomon, the blacksmith who forged his own justice, traveled from plantation to plantation, whispering through the dark. No army, no banners, just a name, a story, and the lingering, unbearable thought: if it happened once, it could happen again. After Riverwood, silence became policy. Sheriff Blackwood's official report was sealed within a week, locked away in the Chatham County Courthouse under vague legal language no one dared to question. The term administrative irregularities appeared again and again, as though bureaucracy could bury the grotesque truth beneath paperwork. But what truly buried the story wasn't paper, it was fear. Plantation owners demanded that no record of the incident reach the newspapers. Ministers were quietly instructed to preach about obedience and divine hierarchy, not justice or sin. And within a month, it was as if Riverwood had never existed. But ghosts, as history proves, don't fade when ignored, they ferment. In 1963, more than a century later, a courthouse renovation crew stumbled upon a set of locked boxes marked case files, R. 1852. Inside were Sheriff Blackwood's notes, the coroner's report, and something more disturbing, sketches. Precise measurements of cages, diagrams annotated in handwriting not belonging to any official. Someone had studied Solomon's work. Historians later discovered that state authorities had intentionally mislabeled and relocated those records during Reconstruction to avoid agitating racial tensions. In other words, they feared the truth might still inspire revolt. And they were right to fear. Because what Solomon built wasn't just a crime, it was a mirror of the entire institution. To speak of it was to confront slavery itself, stripped of its paternal fictions and false civility. So they didn't speak. They erased. That erasure was surgical. The name Solomon vanished from ledgers, replaced with unidentified male, deceased. The Riverwood property was sold under a new name within a year. Even the graves of the Hargrove family bore no mention of their fate, only the simple inscription, "Departed this life, July 1852." Dr. Thomas Mitchell, a historian from Howard University who studied these rediscovered records in the 1960s, once wrote, "It is not the horror of Riverwood that disturbs me most. It is how efficiently it was forgotten. Entire generations were trained to look away, not from blood, but from reflection." He was right. Silence is not absence. It is curation, a choice about what we remember and what we pretend never happened. That choice echoed across decades. Textbooks skipped the year 1852 entirely when discussing Savannah's plantations. Academic journals rejected papers referencing the case, labeling them unsupported folklore. Even the families who had inherited land once connected to Riverwood refused to speak of it, calling it an embarrassment to our lineage. Yet beneath those polite refusals, the silence hummed. And those who dug too deeply into the archives, like Dr. Carver, whose office was vandalized, or Mitchell, who died under mysterious circumstances, discovered that history still defends its ghosts. Riverwood's story wasn't just suppressed. It was protected. Because the truth it carried was too heavy, too corrosive to the myth of Southern grace. A truth that said, sometimes the past doesn't disappear. It's buried alive. It was almost by accident that Riverwood returned to the light. In the summer of 1966, a construction crew clearing land for a housing project near Savannah struck something metallic beneath the soil. They expected a pipe. What they found instead was a tin box, corroded and dented, sealed with wax and wire. Inside were brittle pages, some written in ink, others scratched with charcoal, fragments of Solomon's own writings. No one could have prepared for what those papers revealed. Among them were crude diagrams of cages, measurements written with mathematical precision, and a chilling phrase repeated across several sheets. Let them know the weight of silence. The papers, now locked in the restricted archives of the Georgia State Museum, told a story that no official history had ever dared to print. They suggested that Solomon's plan had been broader. Riverwood was only the beginning. Lists of names, plantation locations, and dates hinted at a coordinated uprising, one meant not to destroy, but to reflect, to turn the mirror outward across the entire South. The discovery caused brief panic in local offices. Officials quietly confiscated the documents, citing historical sensitivity. But it was too late. Copies had already reached academics and journalists. For the first time in a century, the silence cracked. Then came the accidents. One researcher who photographed the documents lost her negatives in a mysterious lab fire. Another, Dr. Margaret Carver, whose paper on psychological resistance in slave societies was scheduled for publication, withdrew from public life after her office was vandalized. Her colleagues recalled finding her door smeared with the words, "Let it rest." But not everyone obeyed that warning. In 1968, amateur historian Thomas Mitchell obtained transcripts of Blackwood's forgotten journal. His work revealed letters between the sheriff and his wife, written after the investigation closed. In one, he confessed, "I no longer see the enslaved faces in the fields as before. I see them now as reflections, mirrors in which our sins are made visible." That single line reframed everything. Solomon's act, though monstrous, had revealed something even more terrifying: awareness. His vengeance wasn't only punishment, it was pedagogy. He had turned the plantation itself into a lesson so unbearable that an entire region conspired to forget it. By the time journalists rediscovered Riverwood, the development project had been abandoned. Workers refused to return, claiming equipment failed and shadows moved through the trees at night. Locals began calling the land the quiet ground. And in 2002, a modest bronze plaque appeared at the site. It mentioned only a plantation once located here. No Solomon, no cages, no mirror, just another layer of polite silence covering the unearthed truth. But in every archive, in every surviving note, the echoes remain, reminders that some stories refuse to die, even when buried twice. Because iron may rust, but memory does not. To understand Solomon, one must understand the language of iron, the way it yields to fire and pressure, the patience it demands, and the permanence it promises. Every hammer strike is a dialogue between force and form. And that was how Solomon lived. Measured, deliberate, exact. The fragments of his writings found in that tin box reveal a man who thought like an engineer, but wrote like a prophet. One passage reads, "Freedom exists first in the mind. The body may be chained, but thought is the first escape." He didn't see rebellion as chaos. He saw it as design, a structure, an inversion of order that could be planned as precisely as any piece of machinery. To Solomon, the cages beneath Riverwood were not mere punishment. They were an equation. Each hinge, each dimension expressed an idea. If you define my life by confinement, then you, too, will live by it. Scholars later called this psychological warfare. But to Solomon it was art. Dark, moral, purposeful art. He turned the very tools meant to oppress him into instruments of revelation. The forge became a pulpit, the iron, his scripture. What's striking is how deeply philosophical his notes were. Amid blueprints and measurements, he wrote short reflections, cryptic, poetic, almost meditative. One line simply said, "The master believes control is strength. He has never known endurance." Another read, "Pain is the only language both sides understand." These words reveal not madness, but method. A man analyzing power as a system and finding its flaw, dependence. The enslaver's authority existed only as long as the enslaved believed in it. Once that belief fractured, even slightly, the entire edifice could crumble. Dr. Robert Freeman, in his 1965 dissertation Psychological Warfare and Slave Resistance, described Solomon's act as an intellectual rebellion disguised as a crime. He wrote, "Solomon's cages were arguments, not weapons, essays in iron, forcing their victims to confront the abstract made physical." And indeed, that's what terrified the South. Because Solomon had proven something unspeakable, that intelligence and patience, the very traits slaveholders thought they owned, could become the tools of their undoing. But there's another layer too, a tragic one. In one of the final lines deciphered from his notes, Solomon wrote, "They made me into a craftsman, then punished me for what I built." That single sentence collapses the entire story into its cruel irony. His talent was nurtured by those who saw him as property, his genius sharpened by their oppression, and it was that very genius that destroyed them. Solomon was not just the blacksmith of iron. He was the blacksmith of consequence, forging a truth so unbearable that history itself tried to melt it back into silence. Yet even now, his words remain like the faint ringing of hammer on steel, echoing long after the fire has cooled. Today, the land where Riverwood once stood is quiet. Children ride bicycles along paved streets that cross what used to be cotton fields. The oaks still bend under the weight of Spanish moss, their roots twisting through soil that has seen more than it remembers. But if you walk there at dusk, when the air hangs heavy and still, locals will tell you the ground hums, not loudly, just faintly, like metal cooling after a long, hot forge. No sign marks the true spot where the house once stood. The historical plaque a mile down the road mentions a plantation of local significance, nothing more. And yet, the past is not gone. It lingers in the silences, in archives, in whispers, in the uneasy knowledge that somewhere beneath that earth, the story of Solomon still breathes. When historians unearthed the forgotten graves in 1969, 7 bodies buried in secret, including Solomon's, there was no ceremony, no acknowledgement. They were reinterred quietly, unmarked, beneath the shade of Bonaventure Cemetery. Near the Hargrove family plot stands a single iron post with no name. Some say it marks Solomon's true grave. Others say it's a warning. Maybe both. What makes the Riverwood story endure isn't just the horror of what happened. It's the truth it exposes, that oppression doesn't simply vanish when its institutions crumble. It mutates, hides, waits. Solomon's act forced a reckoning that no one wanted. It showed how easily the roles of master and slave could reverse when stripped of pretense. How fragile power truly was when built on cruelty and denial. Dr. Mitchell once wrote, shortly before his mysterious death, Solomon did not rebel against humanity, he imitated it. And in that imitation, he revealed its sickness. That may be why his story was buried twice, once beneath brick and again beneath history. To remember him is to confront the uncomfortable question, what happens when justice becomes indistinguishable from vengeance? When the oppressed becomes the mirror of the oppressor? Perhaps that is the enduring terror of Riverwood. Not the cages, not the deaths, but the reflection. The realization that cruelty, once taught, can be learned too well. In the end, the mirror remains. Not in museums or textbooks, but in the way history itself trembles to speak his name. Solomon, the craftsman, the philosopher, the ghost in the forge, turned his suffering into structure, his silence into language. And through that, he left behind not just a crime, but a question. When we look back at the darkness beneath Riverwood, what do we truly see? The horror of one man's vengeance? Or the reflection of a world that created him? Because some stories never die, they wait beneath our feet, whispering through iron and soil, reminding us that the past is not gone. It's only buried.